According to new White House projections, the budget deficit will hit a whopping $1 trillion for fiscal year 2019. This is the first time the U.S. deficit has exceeded the $1 trillion level since the four-year period following the Great Recession. Now, the economy does remain strong, but the growing deficit should worry conservatives who have long wanted to see elected Republicans cut the size of government and government spending. As a candidate, President Trump promised to wipe out the deficit along with all federal debt, but his first years in office have seen the deficit grow. So we're going to talk about what policies he should push to reverse course and make good on his campaign promise. With me now, Chief Economist and Vice President for the Center for State Fiscal Reform at the American Legislative Exchange Council, Jonathan Williams. Jonathan, good to see you.
Thanks for having me back.
Of course, it's good to see you. This is a humongous number. I mean, there's no other way to look at it. $1 trillion. It's kind of hard to fathom that amount of money if you picture it in a stack. This is actually $91 billion. This prediction is $91 billion lower than the original estimate of what the deficit would be this year. But I think I'm confused, I guess, about why the Republican Party has given up on fiscal conservatism, because it is very dangerous for our country to be in a financial situation like this.
Well, let's face the facts. We are in a world of hurt, and there's a reason why I always refer to Washington as the land of make-believe, because as states are out there balancing their budgets, 49 out of the 50 states, as you know, have balanced budget requirements. We don't have one in Washington, D.C., and this is a bipartisan problem that's been building up over the years, and it's going to require both parties coming together to say, we have a real problem when we overspend when it comes to Washington. In fact, as you know, we have record tax revenues coming in because of the strong economy, because of the Trump tax relief package that was passed, because of deregulation, because of so many American businesses now bringing back profits, nearly $1 trillion of profits coming back to the United States since the tax cuts were passed. The culprit here is, and it's not rocket surgery, as my co-author Art Laffer likes to say, this is basic stuff. It's overspending by people in Washington, especially Congress. And I will give my credit where credit's due to the White House. The President and the Office of Management and Budget proposed a budget that cuts more from federal spending than nearly any administration in history. They proposed $3 trillion in spending reductions, which is exactly the kind of formula that we need to get out from under this real problem, because it's not just the $1 trillion number, it's the $22 trillion of national debt that we have to think about.
Well, I think you're right about this, because when you get into this situation, this is not the work of one administration, obviously. This is not something that just President Trump has done, as Democrats might like to try to accuse him. Not at all. This is actually a perfect example. This is a manifestation of years and years of fiscal irresponsibility, of government spending more than they have, of living outside their means and abusing taxpayer money. And this is a lesson to us about why it is so dangerous for government, for politicians to give away free stuff, and why it is so dangerous for government to give away such enormous entitlements. Because once you have given people free stuff, it is very, very difficult to take it away from them. And no politician wants to be the one that says, hey, you're enjoying your free stuff, let me just come in and steal it from you. And so people from both parties, politicians from both parties, stop trying to campaign on that because they want to get elected and they're worried people aren't going to vote for them if they threaten to take away the free stuff.
Well, one of my favorite economists, Thomas Sowell, put it this way: the first law of economics is that we have a scarcity of resources. We don't have everything that we want. The first law of politics, however, is to ignore the first law of economics. And this has been a bipartisan problem. Republicans, in some cases, the big spenders within that party, are to blame. And then Democrats, the big spenders within their party, are to blame as well. But what scares me a little bit is, the previous discussion talking about adding massive new government entitlement programs, massive new government spending, whether it's the Green New Deal and trillions of dollars more that we'd be adding to that number, of this massive number that we have already in terms of debt and deficit. This is the kind of discussion where we need to be going the exact opposite direction and putting government on a diet and looking at ways to control spending. We have some great case studies from the states on a Republican and Democrat basis that have cut spending effectively without compromising core government programs, and they can do it by fishing out waste, fraud, and abuse from government, and also just making sure that government doesn't grow faster than the private sector. I know it's somewhat of a novel concept, but businesses and families have to budget that way. Why doesn't the government?
Right, especially when the government is using the money from businesses and families. That's only fair here. So how do we go about doing this? Because it's such an unpopular political thing, how do we go about scaling back entitlements? Because when you're talking about the amount of money that is spent on entitlements, you have to talk about Medicare. You have to talk about Medicaid. You have to talk about Social Security. You have to talk about those things. No politician wants to talk about them. What do we do to scale back the spending and some of the largest entitlement programs while making sure that it's a politically viable thing to do?
Well, right, and I think we've gotten to a point where people are noticing both this deficit number, the debt number, that I think at some point the calculation has to turn in the minds of elected officials that this is not a political liability, it's a necessity to tackle this issue, because perhaps, as some are suggesting, our next potential downfall for our economy will be one of government's creation of this massive amount of government debt, whether it's at the state and local level with the pension unfunded liabilities that are threatening states like Illinois or Connecticut, or it's at the national level with the even larger numbers. We have to look to things that work. And I was really happy that Chairman Mike Enzi from Wyoming held a hearing recently at Senate Budget Committee talking about what the federal government can learn from the states and what are some success stories. There are things like Colorado's Taxpayers' Bill of Rights that limits the growth of government to the rate of population and inflation growth, making sure that government lives within its means. Things like priority-based budgeting that was done under a Democrat governor in Washington state. These are the kind of things that oftentimes don't get talked about it nearly enough in Washington, that we at ALEC come forward with these solutions every single day to bring state solutions to the federal problem. But there's also international examples. The Swiss debt break, I know, has been one that's been studied that has kept that country out of massive debt problems. But you're right, we do need to talk about this comprehensively. It can't just be looked at in terms of discretionary or non-discretionary areas alone. It needs to be looked at in a holistic measure.
Right. And I think if we don't do that, then our country's in for a world of pain when this becomes, basically, we're on the path to something happening like what happened in Greece, a default on their spending. If we don't do something to stop this, it's going to hurt future generations, maybe not even future generations, maybe the next generation of Americans are going to suffer from this. And I don't think any of us want to leave that to our children and grandchildren. Jonathan, thanks so much for coming on the show, and thanks for your ideas on how to actually solve this problem. I feel like that's not something we get from very many people in Washington, D.C., so I appreciate it.